again for joining us inside the Access Framingham studios. My name is Brendan Fitzpatrick, and I'm pleased to be joined today by the District Attorney for Middlesex County, Marian Ryan. Thanks for coming into the studio today during what's obviously a very busy time for you in your re-election bid, but we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
Happy to be here.
Absolutely. And again, this is in regards to the primary election that is happening on Tuesday, September 1st, the Democratic primary candidacy for the Middlesex County District Attorney's Office. Marian, you are running for re-election in a position that you've held since 2013, and you're running against David Solet, who we spoke to earlier. The registration deadline for the primary, again, is August the 22nd, and there is no Republican candidate in this race, so this is a very big race, obviously, in terms of this position. And we can get into your platform, what you're running on, in just a few minutes. But Marian, for folks who aren't aware, why don't you give us a little bit of your background and some of what you would identify as your key accomplishments, in your opinion, since you've held this position since 2013?
Sure. So I've had the privilege of being in the district attorney's office my entire career. I literally started in the office as an intern and have pretty much done every job across that office before being appointed district attorney by Governor Patrick in 2013. And we can talk, obviously, a bit more about this, but some of the things that I think are the biggest accomplishments of the office under my leadership is with the work of the amazing team that we have. We have taken a county, very large county, 877 square miles, 54 cities and towns, and a population of 1.8 million people, which is larger than the population of 11 states in the United States, and made it a place where we are routinely recognized by FBI data and other sources as one of the safest counties in the United States. And that, I think, is something that really should matter to people, because what that means is they're able to live, work, go to school here, and really do that in a place of great safety. So that is one amazing accomplishment. And then secondly, and we can talk about this, about the platform as well, you know, we are in a time, a really unprecedented time, where the rule of law is under attack. Many of the actions of the federal government impact the way we've been able to do our job. And I've been very clear about understanding what my job is and not being willing to allow others to interfere with that without fighting back about that. In 2018, I organized a group that filed a suit in federal court to stop ICE from coming into our courthouses and taking people out. Because when they're removing people mid-trial, there, number one, is no accountability. If somebody has committed a crime here in Middlesex County, they're taken away. We don't know where they are. We don't know if they're back here, and they've never been held accountable for that crime. That's not my being able to do my job. The second piece is that if somebody hasn't committed a crime, we don't know that either, because we haven't gotten to an end, and we don't know whether somebody who did commit that crime is still among us. So that's a piece, and that suit was successful in getting an injunction from the federal court, the first of its kind in the country, that said that ICE could not come into the courthouse and remove people mid-proceedings, that we had a right to be able to get to resolution of our cases. We were able to keep that injunction in place for a number of years until President Biden took office to allow us to do our job. We continue to have issues occurring in this county, which we know prevent people from being willing to come forward, from being willing to report crime, to seek the help that they need, or to come in. You know, even if you are not someone who might need that kind of protection, we often, in our cases where something has happened to someone, are relying upon people to be witnesses that may have issues with ICE. And when they aren't willing to come in and testify and give us that evidence, help us to prosecute those cases, we are all much less safe. So that's another piece. And then thirdly, I've really been presiding over this and leading this office during a time of great change. We had, you know, the aftermath of the tragedy of George Floyd's killing. We've had COVID. We've had the first and the now partway through the second administration of Trump, as well as during a time of great technological change. And this is an office that has evolved continually to be responding to those different challenges.
Right, and that's a good overview, I suppose, of your priorities as you're running for re-election here. But in terms of the specifics, Your platform running for re-election here, are there any sort of legislation you'd like to be pushing for? Any initiatives you'd like to continue or add on to, introduce within the role as district attorney? What are some key specifics of your platform that you'd be looking to enact if you are to win re-election?
So this race is really about experience, and we've talked a little bit about that. It's also about representation. It's very important that everyone's voice be included in these conversations around public safety. In part, is that affects legislation, lots of those other issues. You know, there are 11 district attorneys in Massachusetts. I have wonderful colleagues, but I am the only woman who has the privilege of serving in this role. And when we think about issues of domestic violence, sexual violence, reproductive health issues, that my voice is one that needs to be at the table. I also had, when I was serving as an assistant district attorney, the great misfortune to be with my former law school boyfriend and also another assistant district attorney to be the victim of an armed robbery that went terribly wrong. He died in that attack. Eventually, people were arrested for that. They were convicted. There have been parole hearings. One of those defendants was a Mattis defendant. He was young at the time. It's led to additional hearings. So my voice, having been through what we actually ask people to do every day, to partner with us after a tragedy in their life and to stay with us for many, many years often, that is a voice that also needs to be at the table. So those are two very important components of this race, both having the experience and also representing voices that we need at the table.
Now, your opponent, David Solet, worked with you within the DA's office for a number of years. In September of 2025, he resigned from his position as the head of the cold case investigation unit. What was your reaction when he informed you that he was going to resign and then run against you?
So David was a valued member of our office. When I created the cold case unit in the end of 2018, beginning of 2019, I invited him. He had gone to work as an advisor to Governor Baker. I invited him to come back to the office. He was a valued member of our office. This is a wonderful job. I understand why people want to have this job. In fact, David had sought the job in 2013 when I was appointed. So I understand that. And, you know, it was unfortunate that he decided then to go and not continue the work he'd been doing with us, but those are those choices people make.
Right, and part of this series, what we're doing here, conversation, as we mentioned, with David as well as you, it gives you an opportunity as well as your opponent to address some of the concerns that the other may have about the other. And one of the things that David Solet contends in regards to your candidacy is that you have not provided enough resources to investigate cold cases after he was the head of that unit within the DA's office. What would you say in response to that contention?
I would say that probably every unit within our office would say that they could use more resources. As I'm sure at this station, every department would say it would be nicer if they had more resources. You know, we operate on the money that we are provided by the legislature, and the legislature's been very good to us. But the very fact that we didn't have a cold case unit till I created it in 2018, 2019, is a reflection of having resources. And one of the things, not only am I proud of the way this county has become safer, but the very practical result is when the legislature gives you a sum of money, if you have crushing caseloads coming in every day, you are less able to use that same bucket of money to do other things. So I had solved a cold case myself that was over 20 years old. I learned an incredible amount from that experience, seeing what it meant to that family, how important it was to the community. I wanted to create a cold case unit earlier than 2018, but it's really just a question of marshaling resources and being able to do that. So, and that comes in part because of the work we've been able to do with our partners in lowering that crime rate. And so, in fact, we have since been able to increase the size of that unit, that it's just a resource. We have lots of good work going on. If I could magically have millions more dollars, we would increase the size of so many of our units, as would, I think, most people in management in any institution or agency would do the same.
Now, just for reference, what's the size of the cold case unit as things stand right now?
So
even if you don't have the specifics.
We have 2 assistant district attorneys assigned there, as well as a paralegal working with them.
Understood. Understood. Now, again, to offer you a chance to rebuttal some of the criticisms levied at you by your opponent, David Solet has provided criticism on you in regards to two other fronts. One aspect, he says you haven't done enough to push to close a loophole regarding dangerousness hearings for certain offenders, including cross-burners, potential offenders of sexual assault cases, and then also that you have not done enough to push for cold case sexual assault statute of limitation changes. I know that's sort of a two-pronged question, but I wanted to give you a chance to respond to those two criticisms from your opponent.
So to back up a bit,
Sure.
you know, a district attorney has no role in the legislature in terms of voting or passing legislation. What we are able to do is advocate for various pieces of legislation. And what I have taken this platform, and I would suggest, and with all due respect to my predecessors and my colleagues, we have the most active legislative agenda in the Commonwealth. I routinely file probably 20 to 25 pieces of legislation per year, which reflect both changes that we have seen, for instance, in prosecuting technological changes that we didn't have before, or closing situations that have arisen in cases that we see, and I'm happy to talk about some of those. But in the Massachusetts legislature, during its 2-year session, approximately 8,700 pieces of legislation are filed every session. Just around 10% of those become law. So there are lots of really good ideas that are out there. And I certainly advocate and work very hard with my legislative partners on the pieces of legislation that I file. As anybody can imagine, your ability to be effective in advocating for something to some extent declines if you advocate for everything. So obviously, we're always making choices about which bill am I speaking out on, which bill am I calling legislators about, what am I doing about that. There's a big difference between not taking to the grand staircase at the State House to speak about a bill and opposing a bill. So I've never opposed any of those other pieces of legislation, and one of which is moot now because the DNA exception was a piece of the supplemental budget that passed recently. But I've never opposed that. But like everyone else, you have to assess what are the chances that this is going to be successful, what else am I advocating for, and marshal your resources around that.
Out of curiosity, are there any pieces of legislation that you and the DA's office currently right now are trying to champion?
Yes, there's a number of pieces of legislation. One of the pieces of legislation I'm very proud of that I was able to garner bipartisan support, which was a very important piece of legislation. It really changed something that we did not have in our statute, and something that I believe Access Framingham, as well as other media, covered, was that there were a number of cases, including the Olympic doctor, including some of the fertility clinic situations where individuals would go in as patients to a doctor. During the course of their treatment, they would be sexually assaulted. And of course, realizing that the person that they had trusted for their medical care, they had sexually assaulted them, they would come to the police and to the district attorney's office seeking prosecution. And the Supreme Judicial Court in Massachusetts at some point said that we could not prosecute those cases because despite the fact that the touching might rise to the level of sexual assault, because the patient, believing them to be part of a treatment, had consented to that touching, it could not be prosecuted. So we had people who were betrayed by their medical professionals who then came to us for help, and we said, we're very sorry, but we can't help you. I worked with Representative Kate Hogan and Senator Tarr, a bipartisan coalition that we built to pass a piece of legislation to close that loophole, to say that if you were sexually assaulted by a medical professional, even if it occurred during the course of treatment, we could now seek to prosecute that individual. That's a really critical piece. I also have legislation pending right now around fines that people may owe to the Registry of Motor Vehicles that they cannot pay, in a way not to waive those fees, but to get them paid and still get them to be able to have access to a license so they don't continue to drive an unregistered vehicle. I have a bill pending to bring across the Commonwealth my Cut It Out program, which has been incredibly successful for about 14, 15 years in Middlesex County. in helping to train hairdressers, barbers, other personal care attendants around recognizing and intervening in domestic violence cases. So I have sort of a whole list of, and I'm happy to make those available. You can post those pieces of legislation. One is about the hate crime bill. And this is an example of sort of the kind of mistake that we find that happens in legislation, obviously, because it gets passed and goes through, if you've ever cut and pasted, goes through lots of changes. Massachusetts has a great hate crime bill, but right now it requires that in order for you to be the victim, say someone comes to your house and they write horribly offensive, hate-filled things on the front door of your house, you have to own that house in order to be the victim. So if you rent, you can't be the victim. If you're a student up at the college and somebody does it on your dorm room door, you can't be the victim. And the second piece that's missing is that even if we are able to identify that perpetrator, prosecute that person, hold them accountable, and the judge orders them to pay restitution for whatever they've damaged or written on, that sort of thing, the actual owner of that property. So for instance, in the example of you in your house, your landlord would actually have to be the victim. Your landlord might recoup the cost of whatever had been damaged or broken, but there's no requirement that they actually use that money to alleviate the damage. So we have a bill that would close both of those gaps in the statute, making it available to the person who's using that space, renting it, or a dorm student, that sort of thing, and also require that any restitution be used to ameliorate the condition.
Right. Now, on your campaign website, right at the front, in big letters, it notes that you champion yourself as a progressive, which I think is interesting in comparison, because when I was speaking with your opponent, there was an article from the Harvard Crimson that described them as apolitical. So two different sort of, politically charged words. You have apolitical and then progressive values being championed. As a district attorney, why do you think it's important to label yourself as a progressive within this role?
Because we live in a place where, number one, I think we have very progressive citizens. And also, we live in a place, I see progressive as not just political. I think progressive means you're thinking about using forensic investigative genealogy to solve old cases. You're thinking about what are responsible ways to use artificial intelligence. You're thinking about all of those things. I don't think anybody would say, I would like to have a district attorney's office that's doing things the way it was doing them in 1960. I think progressive is not particularly political. It's a way of thinking about the world. It's a way about thinking of how do we do things better. We used to, up until a couple of years ago, children as young as 7 in Massachusetts could be charged in juvenile court. I don't think anyone right now thinks that's a good idea. We did back whenever that was passed. So we worked on that legislation and raised that age. I think that encompasses a whole approach to the world.
Right. Now, in the middle of the campaign, of course, there's going to be criticisms levied by two major candidates running for the Democratic Party's nomination for this seat. I did want to ask, and I had asked this to David as well, when looking at his campaign, are there any aspects of his campaign that you'd be looking to say, like, okay, there are some good points there, maybe something that I would want to enact if I am to win re-election? So
I've had the opportunity to run against two very different opponents in primaries, run successfully against them. I am, by training and experience, a trial lawyer. My job is to look at what is my record, what have I been doing well in my office, what do I think we need to continue doing, and make that case. And it really is the job of a challenger running against an incumbent to make their own case. I can't make their case for them.
Fair enough. Now, when people go to fill out their ballots leading up to Tuesday, September 1st, and they go down and they see the Middlesex County DA's race between you and David Solet, what would be one thing you want voters to remember as they're filling out their ballots?
I think that it is important for people to remember the two things I mentioned. This is a job where there is no on-the-ground training. I have spent my career in this office. I've spent the last 13 years leading this office. And I think for the people living in this county, that has meant a place that has been safe. It has meant a place where we have learned to think more broadly about not just, we have to hold people accountable, obviously, who commit transgressions. But the reality is that, with the exception of a tiny percentage of people, whoever we hold accountable will eventually be back in our community. So whatever the sentence that might be being imposed for the accountability piece, we all benefit when we are thinking about how do we not have repeat business. I'm in an industry where we don't want to see people coming back. And to do that requires both the accountability piece. That is the easier part, really. The second part is, how can we intervene to change the trajectory of that person's life so we don't see them back here?
And prevention as well is part of that.
Right. And of course, we'd obviously rather not have the crime happen in the first place, but if it has, what are we doing to make sure? Is the whatever happened driven by addiction? Is it driven by mental illness? Is it driven by any number of factors? And is there a way, after we've held them accountable, that we can then move on to righting that ship so that we don't see them back here again? And I think the proof is always in the pudding. I think that what we see across Middlesex County is a place that has been measured and responsive. We have a very safe county. We have any number of partnerships that I have led across this county, and that's a very important piece because I mentioned resources before. The way you make your resources grow is by partnering with other people who bring their resources to the table, and now you can tackle a problem. So things like my hospital-based task forces around substance abuse and recovery, that has given us a much broader reach. My anti-hate, anti-bias task force, which is community-wide, includes partners at all levels, has helped us to be so much more effective in reaching out and dealing with instances of hate and bias that are one area that we have seen increase across our county. So how do we deal with that? I'm particularly proud of a program we've built, our Empowering Citizens program, where we have trained this past year several hundred high school kids to really have them thinking about, what is my role, not what I'm seeing on TV of back and forth divisive behavior, but what is my role? What should be my role as I become a member of a community? How do I know about voting? How do I know about participating? How am I giving back to my community? That has been successful beyond really even my wildest hopes in giving kids an opportunity to be engaged in that. That has also been bipartisan speakers talking to kids about things like military service, service in legislatures, all of those pieces in ways that they can be helping, and not when they get to be 18, but as a 15-year-old. They can be going to a food pantry. They can be educating themselves on issues, working on a ballot question. And people may wonder, why is that a district attorney's job? It's my job because those young people are going to be our voters. They're going to be our jurors. And we want them to have a good model. One of the best nights this year was when we got to the end of that program and the kids came together with their parents, and we were recognizing them for the things, just amazing, amazing things that they had been able to do in their communities for others. Those are things that people have seen across my tenure in this county, and I hope when they're making that choice on September 1st or before, if they're voting early or voting by mail, that I think when you look at that, and I say this very humbly, you see a record of what has improved not just their lives, but the lives of their community. And I hope that directs where they cast their ballot for me in that September 1st primary.
And again, that September 1st primary, the deadline to register is August the 22nd. In the meantime, Marian Ryan, the current Middlesex County District Attorney, running for re-election in the Democratic primary. We thank you very much for coming into the studio today to speak with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us here at the Access Framingham Studios. My name is Brendan Fitzpatrick, and I'm pleased to be joined today by David Solet. He's one of the two candidates for the Middlesex District Attorney's race in the Democratic Party coming up in just a couple of weeks. We were just talking off camera that September 1st doesn't feel like it's that far away. It's creeping up on us. So as we lead up to the primary, David, we thank you for coming into the studio. Welcome.
I'm really glad to be here.
And again, the primary election will be Tuesday, September 1st. You can register by August the 22nd, and there will be no Republican candidate in this race. So this is a massive one in the Democratic primary for the Middlesex DA seat. And we could go into your platform, David, and what you want to enact if you are eventually elected on September the 1st in the primary election. We can go into all that in just a few minutes. But for folks who may not be aware, I wanted to start by learning about your background and what's led you to this point.
I grew up in the city of Cambridge. I'm the father of two daughters, both graduates of the public schools. I'm a major in the JAG Corps of the U.S. Army Reserve, where I've been an advocate for victims of sexual assault. And I've been a prosecutor in Middlesex County most of my professional life. I graduated with honors from Harvard Law School in 2001, and I went straight to the Middlesex DA's office. I was a domestic violence prosecutor. I was an organized crime prosecutor doing court-authorized wiretap investigations of mafia targets and major drug trafficking organizations. I was the first chief of the Cyber Protection Unit, which was a unit dedicated to fighting online child exploitation and cyber frauds. For 4 years, I was Governor Baker's chief legal counsel for public safety. And then in 2019, I came back to the DA's office to found the cold case homicide unit. And that's what I did the last 6 years.
Right, and that's a long list of, long resume essentially there that you just rattled off there. And of course, you being the chief of the district's cold case unit, you were in that role from 2019 until this past September of 2025 under the current district attorney, Marian Ryan, who you will be running against on Tuesday, the 1st of September. You resigned from that position as the chief of the district's cold case unit in September. What went into that decision, and why make the run for the DA seat now?
I could see from the inside that there were things that were going on in the DA's office, decisions that we were making and decisions that we were refusing to make as an office that I knew were wrong, and I decided to do something about it.
What are some of those decisions specifically?
The most important job of the district attorney's office is to keep people safe, and there were decisions that were obviously the right decision for the district attorney to step forward on and lead on, and the incumbent district attorney would not do that. I think because she did not want to ruffle the feathers of people she thought were political allies. But when the DA knows that there's something wrong, that the law is not sufficient to protect people, the DA needs to be a public advocate for change. I asked her to do some of these things, and she said no. I'll give you an example.
I was going to ask for an example because I don't know what you are at liberty to say with things that are legally based and whatnot, but if there is a specific example.
I'm glad to talk about it. These are policy things. So in Massachusetts and everywhere else in the United States, when somebody's charged with a crime, the normal way that a case tends to proceed is that somebody is booked and then released. And they're released until their trial. And that is as it should be. That's part of our presumption of innocence. But there are a handful of cases that by their nature are so dangerous that it would not be safe to release that person right back out onto the street. Since 2019, there's been a loophole in our law that bars prosecutors in Massachusetts from seeking a dangerousness hearing for people that have committed very serious crimes, crimes like cross-burning, bomb-making, or aggravated rape of a child. And when that case came down and that loophole opened up, Charlie Baker tried to do something about it. And when I worked in his administration, I drafted some of the language that was filed in a bill to try to close those loopholes. Marian Ryan never spoke out in favor of that, and it did not pass. Charlie Baker worked hard to pass it. In fact, you may remember at the end of his time in office, he actually cried at a press conference because he was so distraught. He had met with so many victims of violence asking, why can't you do this for me? And he couldn't get the legislature to move it. When I came back to the DA's office in 2019, I asked Marian Ryan to do that. She had come to me and the other members of her senior leadership team and said, I need a legislative agenda. What should my legislative agenda be? And I said, Marian, the number one thing you need to do is to close the dangerousness loophole. If you don't do that, people are going to get hurt. And she said to me and to the rest of her leadership team, I don't want that responsibility because if I had it and we didn't use it right, people could blame us. And I think that's exactly the wrong way to think about the job of district attorney. The DA is supposed to be out there taking responsibility when we know something is wrong. It does not make me Nostradamus to have predicted that people would get hurt. That was obvious. And in fact, people did get hurt. In Middlesex County in 2024, there was a young woman who had confided in her mom that she had been molested by her stepfather. And she did the right thing telling her mom, and her mom did the right thing telling the police. The district attorney's office indicted that man for 6 counts of aggravated rape of a child. But then he was released to the street with a plastic ankle bracelet. And when he didn't like the way the case against him was proceeding, he snipped off that bracelet. He drove to the town of Acton, where he knew that girl would be. He abducted her, and he killed her. And then he killed himself. And when the Boston Globe asked the district attorney's office, how could that man have been on the street? Marian Ryan's office said he was not detained because the law did not allow us to detain him, basically describing the loophole that she had refused to act on. And even after that girl was killed in our county, she has not done a thing to close that loophole. Since then, we have also lost the ability to seek a dangerousness hearing for armed robbery, which is one of the most dangerous crimes in the whole Massachusetts statute book. Many of the murder cases I've worked on started as armed robberies, and yet she's done nothing, not lifted a finger, not advocated for change with the legislature. The Middlesex district attorney sits in a seat of authority in the county with more state representatives and more state senators than any other DA, but she's refused to do a thing.
Now, through that entire explanation there of that example of the dangerousness loophole, that looks to be a key part of your platform. What are some other key parts of your platform that you'd look to be enacting if you are eventually successful in your campaign?
One of the things that distinguishes the United States from every other developed democracy is our massive homicide rate. And a major driver of our homicide rate in this country is the supply of guns in the hands of civilians. Massachusetts and the rest of the country has a long history of legal, constitutionally protected firearms ownership. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about guns that ends up in the hands of disqualified people, people that do not have a right to have these weapons. In Massachusetts, because we have good gun laws, most of the crime guns actually come in from out of state. 2/3 of the guns used in crimes in Massachusetts come from states like New Hampshire, Maine, Florida, and Georgia. And we actually have a good gun trafficking statute that was passed in 2014. But the incumbent district attorney has not used that statute. And so we continue to have guns flowing into Massachusetts, flowing into Middlesex County from out of state, but there have been virtually no cases brought against the organizations that bring these weapons onto our streets.
Now, in the past, you've also contended that the current district attorney, Marian Ryan, does not provide enough resources to investigate cold cases. Again, you being the chief of the district's cold case unit for about 6 years or so, you've contended that enough resources have not been provided to investigate those cases. It's a notion that she's pushed back on throughout this campaign. But what makes you feel that way, specifically in regards to cold cases?
I led that unit for 6 years. And I asked all the time to get additional attorneys because I felt like the proof of concept had been demonstrated. I was able to solve more than a dozen cold cases, and I'm confident we could solve more with adequate investigative resources. She never would assign me another attorney in the entire 6-year period. She only added another attorney after I told her I was resigning and running against her, I think pretty clearly because she realized that this was going to be a campaign issue and she wanted to try to get ahead of it. The only time she ever authorized any other attorney to help the cold case unit, besides me, was one time she offered up a volunteer lawyer who was a longtime campaign donor of hers. This was a man who had never prosecuted a single criminal case or defended a single criminal case. He had been a multi-year maximum campaign donor to her, including this year. He wrote one memo, and he never came back to the office.
Right. Now, a lot of this conversation has had a lot to do with prosecution, of course, and that's a major role with any district attorney across the country. I was curious about your thoughts in terms of the DA's office in regards to crime prevention. What do you think a DA's office can do, and how would you look to potentially enact some changes to put more of an emphasis on crime prevention in conjunction with prosecution?
There are two key parts for crime prevention. One is helping to reduce recidivism, right? Trying to tailor the response to a crime that you've identified to try to make sure that the person that did it doesn't do it again, especially for cases that involve mental illness or cases that involve drug addiction. There are things we can do to try to steer people back onto the right path, and I think that's a very important thing for the DA's office. Separately, for prevention, there are also things we can do for people that aren't the perpetrators. There are things we can do to help potential victims to keep themselves safe. One of the things that I did when I was the chief of the cyber protection unit is I went to high schools and middle schools all over Middlesex County to speak with students about the way the world was changing around them in real time, about meeting people online, about keeping themselves safe. And that was important because especially where it involves young people and sex, and that's where a lot of the danger is online, not everybody feels comfortable talking with their parents. Not every parent feels comfortable talking with their child. But as early as middle school, that is where these kids are being targeted for exploitation. It's important they hear from an adult that they trust that some of these dangers are out there. One of the things that has frustrated me is that in recent years, the incumbent DA has moved away from what had been a very strong partnership. We used to do all the time. We used to partner with a group that was then called Middlesex Partnerships for Youth, that was constantly creating a back and forth communication between schools, school administrators, parents, and the district attorney's office. And the incumbent district attorney moved away from that relationship. I think that's a mistake. And if I was elected, I would reestablish that relationship and try to restore the lines of communication between the DA's office and the school systems.
Right. A lot of this conversation that we've been having today has gone into your issues with the current district attorney, Marian Ryan. And that's understandable. That's any sort of election. Of course, you're trying to make your case over the other candidate. I'm curious, though, if there are any pros with the current DA's administration and what's been enacted over the years. After working alongside her for as long as you did, are there any initiatives or goals that you actually look at now that are currently enacted and say, yeah, I'd like to continue that if I do eventually become the Middlesex DA?
There's a great deal of work that I expect would be consistent if I were elected. We have a diversion program for juveniles. We have roundtables about domestic violence. Most of these programs existed before the incumbent district attorney got there and have been continued. The incumbent district attorney was part of an ongoing development of the office. I expect many of these programs would stay in place. But when it comes to leadership of the office, I think that's been lacking. I think that part of the job of the district attorney is to motivate and inspire, especially the younger prosecutors who work there, because when you're asking people to do public service, in the real world, we are never going to be able to pay our young prosecutors market wages for good lawyers. We need to make them feel like they love this work, and that's why they're committed to doing it. And I think the district attorney, the current district attorney, has fallen short in that department. That's why we've lost some of our best young lawyers, not to fancy law firms, not to judgeships or professorships at law schools, but to other DA's offices for no raise. That's a sign that they still love being prosecutors, they still care about public service, but they don't want to do it in the Middlesex DA's office. And that's something I want to change.
Now, following the beginning of this primary race, there was an article in the Harvard Crimson, the university's newspaper, that characterized you as someone who would want to operate, and the word they used was apolitically. I don't have the date of the article in front of me right now, but it is out there. You can find the article from the Harvard Crimson. That apolitical tag, would you agree with that characterization of you in your campaign?
Yes, I think that the campaign, of course, is political on some level. It's
Right.
a political campaign. But I think that the district attorney's office's operations, part of what is important to me is that the DA's office have legitimacy. People have to believe that in law enforcement, people are operating on the level. And the only way to do that is to actually be on the level. I'm a Democrat. I'm running in the Democratic primary. I'm glad to talk to any of my friends or anyone else that wants to talk to me about why I think being a Democrat is right for me and why I think other people why I think the values of the Democratic Party are important. But when you're the district attorney, Republicans and Democrats and independents alike have to believe they're going to be treated fairly. They can't feel like they're being treated with favoritism or disfavor, and the DA's decisions have to be based on public safety, not on who's going to be happy and who's going to be unhappy. And when it comes to doing the right thing, one of the reasons I resigned is that the incumbent DA has not been willing to do things that she knows are right. Let me give you another example. Maybe the single straw that broke the camel's back for me was I started the cold case homicide unit to work on homicide cases. But pretty clearly when I was doing that work, I could see that there were unsolved sexual assault cases that I thought with enough work could be solved. I started working on those cases, and I solved several. But one of the cases that I solved was a rape case from the early 1980s where a woman was traveling from out of state for business to Massachusetts. I was always trained in the Army when you're traveling for safety, you don't want to be on the 8th floor of a hotel room because you can't safely jump out an 8th floor window. But you don't want to be on the 1st floor because the first floor gives access to the street. This woman was placed on the first floor of the hotel, and in the middle of the night, a man climbed through the window, tied her up, and sexually assaulted her. As soon as she could get herself free, she called the police, and they looked for the man, but they couldn't find him. They could find no fingerprints. They found copious biological evidence, but in the 80s, there was nothing you could do with that. In the 2000s, for the first time, they were able to develop a major male DNA profile, and they uploaded it to the national database, and they found nothing. And that's where the case sat for almost 20 years. When I started working on this case, it became clear to me that the man who had done this was probably in his late 60s or early 70s by now, and that we were waiting for a phone call that was likely never going to come. And so I tried to do something different. I used forensic genetic genealogy, the technique that was used to catch the Golden State Killer, and I looked for a distant cousin of this person. And I found a distant cousin, and I worked my way down the family tree until I could find a person in the right genetic position. And it turns out this man is alive and healthy and living in Massachusetts. But when I found him and I could confirm that it was him, I couldn't prosecute him because at that time, the statute of limitations in Massachusetts for aggravated rape was just 15 years, with no exception for DNA evidence. So I went to the incumbent DA and I said, the bad news is, even though I found this man, I can't prosecute him. I'm legally barred from prosecuting him. But the good news is we now have the perfect vehicle for going to the legislature and convincing them to change this law. 47 states are in a better place than Massachusetts for protecting victims of sexual assault, including such feminist paradises as West Virginia, Alabama, Oklahoma, Mississippi, but not Massachusetts, which I think we generally think of as a more enlightened place that cares more about the rights of women. But the incumbent district attorney said no. She said, I'm not going to do that. And when I asked her, don't you think that would be the right thing? She said yes. And I said, why don't you want to do it? And she said, not everyone would agree. When I asked her who she meant, she gave me the name of a prominent defense attorney that I knew, but who does not work for the DA's office and does not advocate for victims. That's not her job. When I resigned, I told her face-to-face that I was doing that. I told her why I was resigning. I told her that I was running against her. And one of the things she said, trying to bargain with me, trying to keep me to stay in the office, she said, well, we could change my decision about the rape case. And I said, Marian, you should change your decision because what you did was wrong, but that's not going to change my decision to resign. I resigned in September. She did nothing different in September, nothing different in October, nothing different in November. In December, my campaign website went up, and one of the things it says is, the way we're treating victims in Massachusetts is wrong. 47 states are doing a better job than us. Only then did Marian Ryan call a press conference with Fox 25 to announce for the first time that her office had solved a terrible rape case from the 80s and that she was calling for the reform of the statute of limitations. Nothing changed between when I solved the case and when she made that announcement. Nothing changed but the politics. The right and wrong of protecting victims was exactly the same. And I think that the people of Middlesex County deserve a district attorney who will do the right thing when no one is watching.
And very quickly, David, when the people of Middlesex County in a couple of weeks are filling out their Democratic primary ballots and they go down and see the race for district attorney, what's one thing you would want them to remember when they're looking at between voting for you or voting for Marian Ryan?
I think that I would love for them to know that the person that led the cold case homicide unit effectively is running to reset the office, to bring us in a direction that is more willing to speak boldly and honestly and to lead from principle. I think people have a right to expect that from their district attorney.
Right. And folks, again, that's David Solet. He is one of the two Democratic primary candidates for the Middlesex District County seat. The election will be on Tuesday, September 1st. Registration has to be completed by the 22nd of August. Until then, David, thank you very much for coming into the studio today. We appreciate it. You giving us our time.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it too.